Section 11 of After Dark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. After Dark by Wilkie Collins. The French Governess's Story of Sister Rose. Part First, Chapter 1, Part 1. "Well, Monsieur Guillaume, what is the news this evening?" "None that I know of, Monsieur Justin, except that Mademoiselle Rose is to be married to morrow." "Much obliged, my respectable old friend, for so interesting and unexpected a reply to my question. Considering that I am the valet of Monsieur Danville, who plays the distinguished part of bridegroom in the little wedding comedy to which you refer, I think I may assure you, without offence, that your news is, so far as I am concerned, of the stalest possible kind. Take a pinch of snuff, Monsieur Guillaume, and excuse me if I inform you that my question referred to public news, and not to the private affairs of the two families whose household interests we have the pleasure of promoting." "I don't understand what you mean by such a phrase as promoting household interests, Monsieur Justin." "I am the servant of Monsieur Louis Trudaine, who lives here with his sister, Mademoiselle Rose. You are the servant of Monsieur Danville, whose excellent mother has made up the match for him with my young lady. As servants both of us, the pleasantest news we can have any concern with is news that is connected with the happiness of our masters. I have nothing to do with public affairs, and being one of the old school, I make it my main object in life to mind my own business. If our homely domestic politics have no interests for you, allow me to express my regret, and to wish you a very good evening." "Pardon me, my dear sir, I have not the slightest respect for the old school, or the least sympathy with people who only mind their own business. However, I accept your expressions of regret, I reciprocate your good evening, and I trust to find you improved in temper, dress, manners, and appearance the next time I have the honour of meeting you. Adieu, Monsieur Guillaume, and vive la bagatelle." These scraps of dialogue were interchanged on a lovely summer evening in the year 1789, before the back door of a small house which stood on the banks of the Seine, about 3 miles westward of the city of Rouen. The one speaker was lean, old, crabbed, and slovenly. The other was plump, young, oily mannered, and dressed in the most gorgeous livery costume of the period. The last days of genuine dandyism were then rapidly approaching all over the civilized world, and Monsieur Justin was, in his own way, dressed to perfection, as a living illustration of the expiring glories of his epoch. After the old servant had left him, he occupied himself for a few minutes in contemplating, superciliously enough, the back view of the little house before which he stood. Judging by the windows, it did not contain more than 6 or 8 rooms in all. Instead of stables and outhouses, there was a conservatory attached to the building on one side, and a low, long room, built of wood, gaily painted, on the other. One of the windows of this room was left uncurtained, and through it could be seen, on a sort of dresser inside, bottles filled with strangely coloured liquids, oddly shaped utensils of brass and copper, one end of a large furnace, and other objects, which plainly proclaimed that the apartment was used as a chemical laboratory. "Think of our bride's brother amusing himself in such a place as that, with cooking drugs in saucepans," muttered Monsieur Justin, peeping into the room. "I am the least particular man in the universe, but I must say I wish we were not going to be connected by marriage with an amateur apothecary. Pah! I can smell the place through the window." With these words, Monsieur Justin turned his back on the laboratory in disgust, and sauntered toward the cliffs overhanging the river. Leaving the garden attached to the house, he ascended some gently rising ground by a winding path. Arrived at the summit, the whole view of the Seine, with its lovely green islands, its banks fringed with trees, its gliding boats, and little scattered waterside cottages, opened before him. Westward, where the level country appeared beyond the further bank of the river, the landscape was all aglow with the crimson of the setting sun. Eastward, the long shadows and mellow intervening lights, the red glory that quivered on the rippling water, the steady ruby fire glowing on cottage windows that reflected the level sunlight, led the eye onward and onward along the windings of the Seine, until it rested upon the spires, towers, and broadly massed houses of Rouen, with the wooded hills rising beyond them for background. Lovely to look on at any time, the view was almost supernaturally beautiful now, under the gorgeous evening light that glowed up in it. All its attractions, however, were lost on the valet. He stood yawning, with his hands in his pockets, looking neither to the right nor to the left, but staring straight before him at a little hollow, beyond which the ground sloped away smoothly to the brink of the cliff. A bench was placed here, and 3 persons, an old lady, a gentleman, and a young girl, were seated on it, watching the sunset, and by consequence turning their backs on Monsieur Justin. Near them stood 2 gentlemen, also looking toward the river and the distant view. These 5 figures attracted the valet's attention, to the exclusion of every other object around him. "There they are still," he said to himself discontentedly. "Madame Danville in the same place on the seat, my master the bridegroom dutifully next to her, Mademoiselle Rose the bride bashfully next to him, Monsieur Trudaine the amateur apothecary brother affectionately next to her, and Monsieur Lomaque, our queer land steward, officially in waiting on the whole party. There they all are indeed, incomprehensibly wasting their time still in looking at nothing. Yes," continued Monsieur Justin, lifting his eyes wearily, and staring hard, first up the river at Rouen, then down the river at the setting sun. "Yes, plague take them, looking at nothing, absolutely and positively at nothing, all this while." Here Monsieur Justin yawned again, and returning to the garden, sat himself down in the arbour, and resignedly went to sleep. If the valet had ventured near the 5 persons whom he had been apostrophizing from a distance, and if he had been possessed of some little refinement of observation, he could hardly have failed to remark that the bride and bridegroom of the morrow, and their companions on either side, were all in a greater or less degree under the influence of some secret restraint, which affected their conversation, their gestures, and even the expressions of their faces. Madame Danville, a handsome, richly dressed old lady, with very bright eyes and a quick, suspicious manner, looked composedly and happily enough as long as her attention was fixed on her son, but when she turned from him toward the bride, a hardly perceptible uneasiness passed over her face, an uneasiness which only deepened to positive distrust and dissatisfaction whenever she looked toward Mademoiselle Trudaine's brother. In the same way, her son, who was all smiles and happiness while he was speaking with his future wife, altered visibly in manner and look exactly as his mother altered, whenever the presence of Monsieur Trudaine specially impressed itself on his attention. Then again, Lomaque, the land steward, quiet, sharp, skinny Lomaque, with the submissive manner and the red rimmed eyes, never looked up at his master's future brother-in-law without looking away again rather uneasily, and thoughtfully drilling holes in the grass with his long sharp-pointed cane. Even the bride herself, the pretty innocent girl, with her childish shyness of manner, seemed to be affected like the others. Doubt, if not distress, overshadowed her face from time to time, and the hand which her lover held trembled a little and grew restless when she accidentally caught her brother's eye. Strangely enough, there was nothing to repel, but on the contrary everything to attract, in the look and manner of the person whose mere presence seemed to exercise such a curiously constraining influence over the wedding party. Louis Trudaine was a remarkably handsome man. His expression was singularly kind and gentle, his manner irresistibly winning in its frank manly firmness and composure. His words, when he occasionally spoke them, seemed as unlikely to give offence as his looks, for he only opened his lips in courteous reply to questions directly addressed to him. Judging by a latent mournfulness in the tones of his voice, and by the sorrowful tenderness which clouded his kind earnest eyes whenever they rested on his sister, his thoughts were certainly not of the happy or the hopeful kind, but he gave them no direct expression. He intruded his secret sadness, whatever it might be, on no one of his companions. Nevertheless, modest and self-restrained as he was, there was evidently some reproving or saddening influence in his presence which affected the spirits of everyone near him, and darkened the eve of the wedding to bride and bridegroom alike. As the sun slowly sank in the heavens, the conversation flagged more and more. After a long silence, the bridegroom was the first to start a new subject. "Rose, love," he said, "that magnificent sunset is a good omen for our marriage. It promises another lovely day to morrow." The bride laughed and blushed. "Do you really believe in omens, Charles?" she said. "My dear," interposed the old lady before her son could answer, "if Charles does believe in omens, it is nothing to laugh at. You will soon know better, when you are his wife, than to confound him, even in the slightest things, with the common herd of people. All his convictions are well founded, so well that if I thought he really did believe in omens, I should most assuredly make up my mind to believe in them too." "I beg your pardon, madam," Rose began tremulously. "I only meant—" "My dear child, have you so little knowledge of the world as to suppose that I could be offended—" "Let Rose speak," said the young man. He turned round petulantly, almost with the air of a spoiled child, to his mother as he said those words. She had been looking fondly and proudly on him the moment before. Now her eyes wandered disconcertedly from his face. She hesitated an instant, with a sudden confusion which seemed quite foreign to her character, then whispered in his ear, "Am I to blame, Charles, for trying to make her worthy of you?" Her son took no notice of the question. He only reiterated sharply, "Let Rose speak." "I really had nothing to say," faltered the young girl, growing more and more confused. "Oh, but you had." There was such an ungracious sharpness in his voice, such an outburst of petulance in his manner as he spoke, that his mother gave him a warning touch on the arm, and whispered, "Hush!" Monsieur Lemarque, the land steward, and Monsieur Trudaine, the brother, both glanced searchingly at the bride as the words passed the bridegroom's lips. She seemed to be frightened and astonished, rather than irritated or hurt. A curious smile puckered up Lemarque's lean face, as he looked demurely down on the ground, and began drilling a fresh hole in the turf with the sharp point of his cane. Trudaine turned aside quickly, and sighing walked away a few paces, then came back and seemed about to speak, but Danville interrupted him. "Pardon me, Rose," he said. "I am so jealous of even the appearance of any want of attention toward you, that I was nearly allowing myself to be irritated about nothing." He kissed her hand very gracefully and tenderly as he made his excuse, but there was a latent expression in his eye which was at variance with the apparent spirit of his action. It was noticed by nobody but observant and submissive Monsieur Lomaque, who smiled to himself again, and drilled harder than ever at his hole in the grass. "I think Monsieur Trudaine was about to speak," said Madame Danville. "Perhaps he will have no objection to let us hear what he was going to say." "None, madam," replied Trudaine, politely. "I was about to take upon myself the blame of Rose's want of respect for believers in omens, by confessing that I have always encouraged her to laugh at superstitions of every kind." "You, a ridiculer of superstitions?" said Danville, turning quickly on him. "You, who have built a laboratory? You, who are an amateur professor of the occult arts of chemistry, a seeker after the elixir of life? On my word of honor, you astonish me." There was an ironical politeness in his voice, look, and manner as he said this, which his mother and his land steward, Monsieur Lomaque, evidently knew how to interpret. The first touched his arm again, and whispered, "Be careful." The second suddenly grew serious, and left off drilling his hole in the grass. Rose neither heard the warning of Madame Danville, nor noticed the alteration in Lomaque. She was looking round at her brother, and was waiting with a bright affectionate smile to hear his answer. He nodded, as if to reassure her, before he spoke again to Danville. "You have rather romantic ideas about experiments in chemistry," he said quietly. "Mine have so little connection with what you call the occult arts, that all the world might see them, if all the world thought it worth while. The only elixirs of life that I know of are a quiet heart and a contented mind. Both those I found years and years ago, when Rose and I first came to live together in the house yonder." He spoke with a quiet sadness in his voice, which meant far more to his sister than the simple words he uttered. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned for a moment from her lover, and took her brother's hand. "Don't talk, Louis, as if you thought you were going to lose your sister, because—" Her lips began to tremble, and she stopped suddenly. "More jealous than ever of your taking her away from him," whispered Madame Danville in her son's ear. "Hush! Don't for God's sake take any notice of it," she added hurriedly, as he rose from the seat and faced Trudaine with undisguised irritation and impatience in his manner. Before he could speak, the old servant Guillaume made his appearance, and announced that coffee was ready. Madame Danville again said "Hush!" and quickly took one of his arms, while he offered the other to Rose. "Charles," said the young girl amazedly, "how flushed your face is, and how your arm trembles!" He controlled himself in a moment, smiled, and said to her, "Can't you guess why, Rose? I'm thinking of to morrow." While he was speaking, he passed close by the land steward on his way back to the house with the ladies. The smile returned to Monsieur Lomaque's lean face, and a curious light twinkled in his red rimmed eyes, as he began a fresh hole in the grass. "Won't you go indoors and take some coffee?" asked Trudaine, touching the land steward on the arm. Monsieur Lomaque started a little, and left his cane sticking in the ground. "A thousand thanks, monsieur," he said. "May I be allowed to follow you?" "I confess the beauty of the evening makes me a little unwilling to leave this place just yet." "Ah, the beauties of nature! I feel them with you, Monsieur Trudaine. I feel them here." Saying this, Lomaque laid one hand on his heart, and with the other pulled his stick out of the grass. He had looked as little at the landscape or the setting sun as Monsieur Justin himself. They sat down side by side on the empty bench, and then there followed an awkward pause. Submissive Lomaque was too discreet to forget his place and venture on starting a new topic. Trudaine was preoccupied and disinclined to talk. It was necessary, however, in common politeness, to say something. Hardly attending himself to his own words, he began with a commonplace phrase. "I regret, Monsieur Lomaque, that we have not had more opportunities of bettering our acquaintance." "I feel deeply indebted," rejoined the land steward, "to the admirable Madame Danville for having chosen me as her escort hither from her son's estate near Lyons, and having thereby procured for me the honour of this introduction." Both Monsieur Lomaque's red-rimmed eyes were seized with a sudden fit of winking as he made this polite speech. His enemies were accustomed to say that whenever he was particularly insincere or particularly deceitful, he always took refuge in the weakness of his eyes, and so evaded the trying ordeal of being obliged to look steadily at the person whom he was speaking with. "I was pleased to hear you mention my late father's name at dinner in terms of high respect," continued Trudaine, resolutely keeping up the conversation. "Did you know him?" "I am indirectly indebted to your excellent father," answered the land steward, "for the very situation which I now hold. At a time when the good word of a man of substance and reputation was needed to save me from poverty and ruin, your father spoke that word. Since then I have, in my own very small way, succeeded in life, until I have risen to the honour of superintending the estate of Monsieur Danville. Excuse me, but your way of speaking of your present situation rather surprises me. Your father, I believe, was a merchant, just as Danville's father was a merchant. The only difference between them was that one failed and the other realized a large fortune. Why should you speak of yourself as honoured by holding your present place?" "Have you never heard," exclaimed Lomaque, with an appearance of great astonishment, "or can you have heard and forgotten, that Madame Danville is descended from one of the noble houses of France? Has she never told you, as she has often told me, that she condescended when she married her late husband, and that her great object in life is to get the title of her family, years since extinct in the male line, settled on her son?" "Yes," replied Trudaine, "I remember to have heard something of this, and to have paid no great attention to it at the time, having little sympathy with such aspirations as you describe. You have lived many years in Danville's service, Monsieur Lomaque, have you?" He hesitated for a moment, then continued, looking the land steward full in the face, "Have you found him a good and kind master?" Lomaque's thin lips seemed to close instinctively at the question, as if he were never going to speak again. He bowed. Trudaine waited. He only bowed again. Trudaine waited a third time. Lomaque looked at his host with perfect steadiness for an instant, then his eyes began to get weak again. "You seem to have some special interest," he quietly remarked, "if I may say so without offence, in asking me that question." "I deal frankly, at all hazards, with everyone," returned Trudaine; "and, stranger as you are, I will deal frankly with you. I acknowledge that I have an interest in asking that question, the dearest, the tenderest of all interests." At those last words his voice trembled for a moment, but he went on firmly. "From the beginning of my sister's engagement with Danville, I made it my duty not to conceal my own feelings. My conscience and my affection for Rose counselled me to be candid to the last, even though my candour should distress or offend others. When we first made the acquaintance of Madame Danville, and when I first discovered that her son's attentions to Rose were not unfavourably received, I felt astonished, and though it cost me a hard effort, I did not conceal that astonishment from my sister." Lomaque, who had hitherto been all attention, started here, and threw up his hands in amazement. "Astonished, did I hear you say? Astonished, Monsieur Trudaine, that the attentions of a young gentleman, possessed of all the graces and accomplishments of a highly bred Frenchman, should be favourably received by a young lady? Astonished that such a dancer, such a singer, such a talker, such a notoriously fascinating ladies' man as Monsieur Danville should, by dint of respectful assiduity, succeed in making some impression on the heart of Mademoiselle Rose? Oh, Monsieur Trudaine, venerated Monsieur Trudaine, this is almost too much to credit." Lomaque's eyes grew weaker than ever, and winked incessantly as he uttered this apostrophe. At the end he threw up his hands again, and blinked inquiringly all round him in mute appeal to universal nature. "When, in the course of time, matters were further advanced," continued Trudaine, without paying any attention to the interruption, "when the offer of marriage was made, and when I knew that Rose had in her own heart accepted it, I objected, and I did not conceal my objections." "Heavens!" interposed Lomaque again, clasping his hands this time with a look of bewilderment. "What objections? What possible objections to a man, young and well bred, with an immense fortune and an uncompromised character? I have heard of these objections. I know they have made bad blood, and I ask myself again and again, what can they be? God knows, I have often tried to dismiss them from my mind as fanciful and absurd," said Trudaine, "and I have always failed. It is impossible in your presence that I can describe in detail what my own impressions have been, from the first, of the master whom you serve. Let it be enough if I confide to you that I cannot, even now, persuade myself of the sincerity of his attachment to my sister, and I feel, in spite of myself, in spite of my earnest desire to put the most implicit confidence in Rose's choice, a distrust of his character and temper, which now, on the eve of marriage, amounts to positive terror. Long, secret suffering, doubt, and suspense wring this confession from me, Monsieur Lomaque, almost unawares, in defiance of caution, in defiance of all the conventionalities of society. You have lived for years under the same roof with this man. You have seen him in his most unguarded and private moments. I tempt you to betray no confidence. I only ask you if you can make me happy by telling me that I have been doing your master grievous injustice by my opinion of him. I ask you to take my hand, and tell me if you can, in all honour, that my sister is not risking the happiness of her whole life by giving herself in marriage to Danville to morrow." He held out his hand while he spoke. By some strange chance, Lomaque happened just at that moment to be looking away toward those beauties of nature which he admired so greatly. "Really, Monsieur Trudaine, really, such an appeal from you at such a time amazes me." Having got so far, he stopped and said no more. "When we first sat down together here, I had no thought of making this appeal, no idea of talking to you as I have talked," pursued the other. "My words have escaped me, as I told you, almost unawares. You must make allowances for them and for me. I cannot expect others, Monsieur Lomaque, to appreciate and understand my feelings for Rose. We two have lived alone in the world together. Father, mother, kindred, they all died years since and left us. I am so much older than my sister that I have learned to feel toward her more as a father than as a brother. All my life, all my dearest hopes, all my highest expectations have centred in her. I was past the period of my boyhood when my mother put my little child sister's hand in mine, and said to me on her deathbed, 'Louis, be all to her that I have been, for she has no one left to look to but you.' Since then, the loves and ambitions of other men have not been my loves or my ambitions. Sister Rose, as we all used to call her in those past days, as I love to call her still, Sister Rose has been the one aim, the one happiness, the one precious trust, the one treasured reward of all my life. I have lived in this poor house, in this dull retirement, as in a paradise, because Sister Rose, my innocent, happy, bright faced Eve, has lived here with me. Even if the husband of her choice had been the husband of mine, the necessity of parting with her would have been the hardest, the bitterest of trials. As it is, thinking what I think, dreading what I dread, judge what my feelings must be on the eve of her marriage, and know why and with what object I made the appeal which surprised you a moment since, but which cannot surprise you now. Speak if you will, I can say no more." He sighed bitterly, his head dropped on his breast, and the hand which he extended to Lomaque trembled as he withdrew it and let it fall at his side. The land steward was not a man accustomed to hesitate, but he hesitated now. He was not usually at a loss for phrases in which to express himself, but he stammered at the very outset of his reply. "Suppose I answered," he began slowly, "suppose I told you that you wronged him, would my testimony really be strong enough to shake opinions, or rather presumptions, which have been taking firmer and firmer hold of you for months and months past? Suppose, on the other hand, that my master had his little—" Lomaque hesitated before he pronounced the next word. "His little infirmities, let me say, but only hypothetically, mind that, infirmities. And suppose I had observed them, and was willing to confide them to you, what purpose would such a confidence answer now, at the 11th hour, with Mademoiselle Rose's heart engaged, with the marriage fixed for to morrow? No, no, trust me." Trudaine looked up suddenly. "I thank you for reminding me, Monsieur Lomaque, that it is too late now to make inquiries, and by consequence too late also to trust in others. My sister has chosen, and on the subject of that choice my lips shall be henceforth sealed. The events of the future are with God. Whatever they may be, I hope I am strong enough to bear my part in them with the patience and the courage of a man. I apologize, Monsieur Lomaque, for having thoughtlessly embarrassed you by questions which I had no right to ask. Let us return to the house. I will show you the way." Lomaque's lips opened, then closed again. He bowed uneasily, and his sallow complexion whitened for a moment. Section 12.